Ladies and gentlemen, as chair of the Executive Committee of the Middle Eastern Studies Student Association, alias MESSA, it is my pleasure to welcome you here at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar for this third annual undergraduate research conference on Middle Eastern Studies, which this year revolves around the theme of globalization in the Middle East, youth, media, and resources. I would like to begin by noting that I'm standing here today on behalf of the entire association. Each and every one of its members have worked persistently hard over the past several months to translate the vision for this event into practice. Hence, allow me to ask you to warmly, and I admit prematurely, applaud both the Executive Committee as well as the Vital Advisory Board of the Association for their remarkable devotion, close collaboration, enthusiasm, and sense of purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a round of applause. Now, while much could be said about the theme of our conference this year, as reflected in the abundance of past and present occurrences across this dynamic region, I would like to here and predominantly address the purpose of this conference at large, not least as our distinguished panelists are far more qualified and certainly more likely to provide thematic insight. First, I would like to emphasize that this annual research conference is more than an occasion for oratory. It is more than an opportunity to feast culinary delights, of which I can assure you there will be plenty. And it is certainly not intended to facilitate the extension of resumes by yet another line. Instead, this conference strives to enable what much of higher education, at least as I've come to perceive it, scarcely allows for. Namely, instances not solely for analytical thinking, succeeded by a peculiar, often mind-numbing combination of reiteration and oratory, but rather opportunities for creative thinking, amid a world that, as Keynes notes in his general theory of employment, interest, and money, is shaped by little else than ideas. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to read George Orwell's 1984, a work once scrutinized, now acclaimed, and I was struck by the following phrase, and I quote, "Orthodoxy is not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness." While the world as we know it is fortunately distant from the dystopia that Orwell illustrates, its sensible evolution appears contingent upon the cultivation of the very processes that are deemed both unorthodox and heretical in Orwell's 1984. Concretely, these pivotal processes assume the form of autonomous, rigorous, and thorough inquiry, however perilous to vested interests, analytical, critical, and creative thinking, however inconvenient, and amid rationalization, colorful, contrasting, and nuanced speech, however nonconform. These processes, I believe, must inform those whose ideas shape possible futures, and these processes are what this conference is intended to foster. Now, this year, we're truly pleased to welcome a distinguished group of 14 young scholars, all of whom have undergone a competitive and rigorous assessment by fellow undergraduates in order to present and enhance their work here at Georgetown. And we have absolutely no doubt that the nature of their interchange will be reflective of an abiding commitment to the authority of ideas. Indeed, we anticipate 2 days of intriguing presentations and lively discussions about a wide range of economic, political, and social issues pertaining to the Middle East. As diverse as the respective issues are its presenters, who have come from the American University in Cairo, the American University of Iraq, Sulaimani, Harvard University, Johns Hopkins University, Northwestern University in Qatar, Princeton University, the University of California, Riverside, the University of Southern California, as well as Georgetown University here in Qatar. I highly encourage you to partake in our interactive sessions, both this Friday and Saturday, not solely due to the relevance of the issues that are to be presented, but as your questions, your comments, and suggestions will enable our delegates to further strengthen their individual research. Seize this opportunity to engage with young scholars in the course of sessions such as Pervasive Politics, Media and the State, Progress in Peril, Bridging the Gender Gap, and Subtle Revolt, Art of Change. I moreover invite you to explore the papers presented in our inaugural Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, which our editor-in-chief, Khawla Al-Dabasti, has skillfully crafted over many months. It will come forth in April and partner with Bloomsbury and potentially even with the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs under the leadership of William Handel at the Washington, D.C. campus. Ladies and gentlemen, before handing over to Almaha Al-Hamadi, Committee Vice Chair, who will introduce the moderator of our panel this evening, Georgetown University Professor Abdallah Al-Aryan, allow me to conclude with a heartfelt hope for the very students that MESSA eagerly serves. Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar is an institution that is blessed with extensive resources, accommodates an extraordinarily accessible corpus of faculty and staff, and provides for an exceptionally diverse group of students. All those are qualities that are unlikely to be found elsewhere in the vast landscape of higher education and that are crucial for citizens of a world that at least appears to have been flattened. Thus, I have reason to believe that those who learn here, whether at this point in time or in the future, will find themselves in the invigorating company of teachers who, as a member of this institution recently wrote, seek to fulfill their vital role, and I quote, as mentor and midwife. These teachers, so I hope, will enable the young to recognize the fertility of ideas and allow unspoiled minds to wonder and to wander so that unconstrained imagination eventually comes to ardent reality. Now, contrary to what Lawrence Summers, then president of Harvard University, suggested, the authority of ideas and the idea of authority need not to be opposite ends of any given spectrum and thereby mutually exclusive. Instead, they ought to be mutually legitimizing. There's little doubt that in a world as muddy and as messy as ours, differences inevitably arise. Yet I urge each and every one of us here this evening to never lose sight of the numerous commonalities that characterize us, so that whenever we choose to defend what we have sound reason to value, we will not decide to turn from one another, but will rather turn toward each other, determined to foster the human project in whatever little ways we can, in the spirit of reciprocity. Finally, I would like to encourage our delegates and those who learn at this institution and elsewhere to dare to think, to dare to question, and to dare to differ, not for the sake of exceptionalism, but to truly serve the communities of which we are part, as well as the region and the world in which these are embedded. Let us not forget that true service should not solely comfort, but should challenge both the serving and the served. Ladies and gentlemen, may this conference come to be fruitful and may your experiences come to be joyful. On behalf of MESSA, I would like to thank you very much.
Hi, good evening, everyone. The Middle Eastern Studies Student Association would like to introduce the panelists of Hotspot Middle East, The Road Ahead. Mohammed Harb, Dr. Matthew Buehler, Dean Gerd Noneman, Dr. Jocelyn Mitchell, Zachary Huffman, Khadija Masood, and our panel moderator, Abdallah Al-Aryan. Professor Abdallah Al-Aryan is an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service here in Qatar. In 2011, he received his doctorate in history from Georgetown University, where he wrote his dissertation on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt during the decade of the 1970s. His research interests include Islamic social movements, U.S. policy towards the Middle East, Islamic law and society, and the history of Islam in the United States. He received his master's degree in sociology of religion from the London School of Economics and his BA in political science from Duke University. He's a frequent contributor to Al Jazeera English Network and website. His first book will be published by Oxford University Press this June. It is entitled Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt. Please join me in welcoming the panel to stage.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. I think your presence here and the organizers of this conference as well, their interest in these subjects extends beyond just their academic interest, and we can see that they have a passion that goes far beyond the classroom, and hopefully beyond Georgetown, that their commitment to the examination of the very critical issues that we're here to talk about today. And I think it's a reflection of the kind of atmosphere that we've cultivated here at Georgetown. And it's my very distinct pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel here with us. And I'll begin to my right with Dr. Gerd Noneman, who is, of course, the Dean of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in Qatar and Professor of International Relations and Gulf Studies. Prior to his appointment as Dean, he served as Professor of International Relations and Middle East Politics and Al-Qasmi Professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter, where he also directed the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and the Center for Gulf Studies. Dean Noneman is Associate Editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies, and among his recent publications, which of course are many, includes the Arabic translation of his book, Saudi Arabia in the Balance. Dr. Jocelyn Mitchell, to my left, is an assistant professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, where she teaches classes on American and comparative politics. She defended her dissertation in political science entitled Beyond Allocation, the Politics of Legitimacy in Qatar at Georgetown University in June of 2013. Dr. Mitchell's research interests in comparative political science include political economy, authoritarianism, legitimacy, and state building. She's the primary investigator on a $150,000 Europe grant from the Qatar National Research Fund on survey and ethnographic research of Qatari female participation in civil society, particularly in women's gatherings. Dr. Matt Buehler is an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee's Department of Political Science. He received his PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Buehler's research area is comparative politics with expertise in the Arab world. His main research interests include democratization, authoritarianism, Islamist movements, North African political parties, and Moroccan politics. This year, Dr. Buehler is serving as a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in Qatar. Posted at the Center for International and Regional Studies, he aims to complete his book project entitled The Social Base of Divide and Rule, Left Islamist Opposition Alliances in North Africa's Arab Spring. Mohammed Khalil Harb is a senior at SFS-Q, majoring in culture and politics with a certificate in Arab and regional studies. He was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and has been residing in Doha since 2007. Mohammed Khalil has interned as the co-director of programming for the UNICEF, Washington, D.C., and is currently the Secretary General of the Georgetown Model United Nations. He's currently pursuing an honors thesis titled Living and Imagining Beirut, which focuses on class conflict in urban spaces. Khadija Mahsoud is a senior at SFS-Q. Majoring in international politics, she transferred to Georgetown after having studied at university in Pakistan. Since moving to the Middle East, she has developed a greater interest in studying Qatar and has participated in a research project analyzing urban space in Doha. She's also interested in Middle Eastern politics and in particular GCC-Iran relations. Zach Huffman is joining us from Princeton University, where he's studying politics and Near Eastern studies. So the format of this discussion will be broadly thematic, so we'll get into some questions about current events that have been taking place, more long-term developments, and we'll get into some specifics in terms of things as they're happening in real time, especially things as we're experiencing them even as we speak. Though I'll on occasion maybe call on some of the panelists who I think may have a particular interest in some of the questions, but all the panelists are more than welcome, of course, to jump in at any time. Feel free to kind of engage with one another in debate or in more of an extended discussion. I'm here just to kind of throw out some questions for our consideration, and just to let you know, these questions were compiled by the MESSA board, and many of the students, of course, are reflecting their interest here in the questions that will be asked today in terms of the kinds of things that students at SFS-Q are thinking about in the course of their studies and in their personal interests. And so I thought we might begin with a topic that I'm sure is on all of our minds because of the fact that it's very close to home. And this, of course, is the escalating tensions between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors, led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain. All three countries, of course, earlier this month withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar. and we've heard a lot in the press about the possibility of even more escalating tensions, although we haven't heard of direct sources coming from Saudi Arabia, but we've heard that some of the demands on Qatar include the closing down of the media outlet Al Jazeera, the network, along with even perhaps some of the other American institutions like Brookings, for instance, which all of us, of course, are familiar with. And so my question was to the panel, but perhaps I'll address this to Dean Donovan first. To what do you attribute these escalating tensions between Qatar and its neighbors, and how do you foresee them being resolved?
Well, first of all, Brookings is not going to close. Not even the Emiratis, in fact, saying that. It just, it's always worth taking some of these media reports with a pinch of salt, or several pinches of salt. I think it's an interesting illustration of something that goes on around the world, but in particular in the Arab world and the Middle East, which is a struggle to define what's a legitimate political order, and alongside and intertwined with the question, what is the identity both of the country and of the system, the social and political system. And I think this then tends to come up against particular instances of trouble. And these can be trouble associated with dynastic succession. It can be trouble associated with economic problems, inability to provide employment, and so on. So in the case of Egypt, we all know what that is, and I'm sure we're going to cover the Egyptian case later on. In the case of Saudi Arabia, again, the definition of what it is to be Saudi Arabia, what the system in Saudi Arabia stands for in terms of the defense of Islam, yes, but how, and what does that mean? In terms of the rule of the Al Saud, yes, what does that mean exactly? Who amongst the Al Saud? What's their role? These questions become much more problematic at times when say, there's a youth bulge, that's to say, questions of employment, when there are pockets of poverty as well, when it perhaps intersects with questions of of sectarian belonging, and when all of this is happening in two contexts, domestic and regional. The regional context, of course, as we know, that a lot of these cleavages and these questions cross boundaries, and there are suspicions of what happens on the other side of the boundary. And the domestic context is, in the case of Saudi Arabia, of course, King Abdullah, while generally very well liked, is very old, is perhaps not the consistent and ever-present coherent decision maker that he might have been. And elsewhere, there are questions about who is going to take this forward amongst the next generation of princes, so the next generations of princes. So put all of that together, and you can see there might be some nervousness in some circles in Saudi Arabia about how to react to everything that's going on. And the everything, of course, comes down in particular at the moment to Egypt, Syria, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is seen as a player in these places, as complicating life for the vision of what might need to happen to Egypt, and as an alternative worldview, an alternative ideological position that might be seen as a challenge conceptually to the Saudi definition, or to the definition of some forms of Saudi identity and rule. So I think it's that combination of factors that made them that made some in Saudi Arabia, not all, very nervous, and made them lash out. And I think there is then there is a further factor, of course, that we're all aware of, very specific Saudi-Qatari history, dating back to when the father Emir took power, and when Saudi Arabia was seen by some here as not having laid much in the way of a group of people who tried to overturn the takeover at the time. And there is an even longer running dynamic, of course, which sees Saudi Arabia as the elder brother, the giant really in the place, in the family, the Gulf family, and Qatar as a small, younger sibling that from the time the father Emir took over, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, was no longer willing to follow the instructions from their older brother. So, that sort of bilateral tension gets exacerbated. It kept flaring up time and again. There were moments of more and more irritation in the Saudi media at times. That was fluctuating, but it's suddenly become acute because of this other context that I've been trying to elucidate, not particularly lucidly.
Professor Mitchell, would you like to add something?
Well, thank you, Gerd, for saying every historical fact that I would have brought up. But I would just reiterate that it's clear that Saudi Arabia is posturing in a particularly angry and aggressive manner right now. But is it a mountain or a molehill? And I think that the media has really jumped into this panic and sensationalist mode without taking into account the history between the countries. And as Gerd mentioned, for example, this is even from before 1995. You can trace border disputes in the Khor al-Udeid area between Qatar and Saudi Arabia since the 1930s. And these border disputes were only vaguely resolved in different agreements in 65, 74, 82, and all of which paved the way for even physical clashes between Saudi and Qatari border guards on several occasions, even in the early 1990s. So even before Amir Hamid came to power and did really assert Qatari independence from a previous kind of yes man strategy with Saudi Arabia, even before that, there was always these tensions. So it is significant that Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE withdrew their ambassadors recently, but it shouldn't be seen as something that different from the bickering that's really gone back and forth between the brotherly countries of the GCC for decades.
Professor Buehler?
I guess my point is more of a question than a comment, but I'm wondering what the other panelists think about the specific non-intervention component of the criticism from the Saudis. I mean, what's the backstory with that? Is this kind of the rivalry between the Salafi-backed Saudi groups and the Ikhwan, the Qatari-backed Muslim Brotherhood groups, or what? I mean, what do you all think about that?
Well, I'm happy to give it a go. The accusation of intervention is really, I suppose you might say, seriously overdrawn. But intervention is seen, I think, in two ways. One, the support as perceived from the outside by Qatar for the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood is seen as complicating Saudi life, both in its foreign policy and potentially domestically. I think domestically, that's a complete, again, an overstatement of the threat. There is no serious domestic Muslim Brotherhood threat in Saudi Arabia, even less so in the UAE. But that's the perception. And the second one is kind of linked to that. It's the position that Al Jazeera, Arabic at least, has been seen to take in supporting this. And of course, Al Jazeera does penetrate beyond Qatar's boundaries. So it's these two things that are interlinked that are seen as or that are portrayed as intervention. But I think, again, it goes back to the particular concern over, grafted onto this older history that Jocelyn was also talking about, but a particular concern over the sense that a movement that is recognized as having some fairly significant social base around the Middle East, being a potential ideational challenger to the Saudi narrative, and to also, of course, the Abu Dhabi narrative, both at home and in the region. But it's absolutely right that while I've always maintained that Qatar does not have an ideological foreign policy, is not ideologically committed to the Muslim Brotherhood, I think they are committed to not having the type of Islam that some Saudi policies have supported in the past.
Zach?
I think, kind of piggybacking off of that point, I think the region right now is pretty unstable, and obviously the Middle East has always been an unstable area, but especially with the vacuum that Syria has created. It's given Qatar an opportunity to kind of flex its muscles a little bit and provide some groups that have kind of risen up in the past maybe 3 years, some financial support, whether that's public or private. I guess back in the States in Washington, something gets talked about a lot. so the rivalry's been going on for many years, and it seems that now would be a time when Qatar would have the ability to kind of like really push maybe some power that they haven't felt they've had in the past couple years. The vacuum has created the opportunity to kind of bring the rivalry, I guess, to the fore more than it has been in the past. Financials are a very easy way to kind of like get the ball rolling, and I think if they're trying to step out of the shadow of their big brother, it's a really like probably poignant way to do so.
Khadija?
I just have to add that a lot of this is about image, in my opinion, in that the image of a foreign benefactor, or some would say foreign intervener, was primarily Saudis to claim. And then now Qatar is not shirking away from policies that are unabashedly political. And it's one thing for countries in the GCC, such as the UAE, to build up a brand that has economic and cultural capital, and it's a totally different thing for a country to build up a brand that is inclusive of policies that stir things up, I suppose. So I think it's about that too, and about possibly Saudi fearing that it is going to lose that image, or that it's not going to be the sole, benefactor of other countries in the Middle East and the Near East in the future.
I also think the issue pertains to the fact that maybe with regards to the Gulf Cooperation Council or the GCC, there's an inability to reach a foreign policy in particular about certain countries in the Arab Spring, or maybe the GCC's relation to the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, which would partly justify why Saudi Arabia wants Qatar to not intervene in certain aspects. But I think if we're talking about kind of a paradigm of rise of Qatar, it's not just with the Arab Spring. I mean, Qatar has been acting as a mediator for a while now with regards to the conflict in Sudan, or with the government deadlock in Lebanon, or with the recent release of the nuns in Syria. So I think there's a general fear of the role of Qatar as a skilled mediator kind of beneath the surface in the Arab world.
I would just like to draw it open a little bit, maybe picking up on what I started out by saying, which is it's not just about Saudi Arabia and Qatar, although they have a particular history. If you look at what's happening, the UAE reaction, well, let's say Bahrain simply did what the Saudis asked them to do. But the UAE, just like I would say, in fact, in Saudi Arabia, it is not all of Saudi Arabia, even amongst the elite. I cannot believe there are certain very senior people who would actually subscribe to the judgment that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. That's a real existential threat to the Saudi system. But in the UAE too, of course, the UAE is 7 emirates. And you can bet that other than the police chief in Dubai, not many people subscribe to the policy that's been announced, that the UAE is now following. That's very much Abu Dhabi. And within Abu Dhabi, particularly the Al Nahyan and the young, the new generation since Sheikh Zayed passed away, the new generation of the Al Nahyan. And it's, in part, I guess, you could say it's a personal proclivity of the leader. It's his background, in part, which is very much security oriented. But it's really that bigger thing about it's a narrative. You build up a narrative about what it means to be an Abu Dhabian and what it means to be a leader in Abu Dhabi and in the Emirates. And that narrative is potentially challenged by organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood. As it happens, I think they've vastly overestimated the potential threat that the Brotherhood poses to this. And in fact, perhaps, if anything, one is almost at the risk of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's that kind of bigger question about trying to fix your narrative and getting everybody to go along with your narrative about what the state and what the identity of the nation should be, which incidentally is not just happening in Saudi Arabia and UAE, but that narrative being challenged by potential movements that have a significant social base, even if really elsewhere in the region.
Yeah, I guess if I could follow up from that, then, I mean, it sounds like we're talking a little bit more about the perceptions of what Qatar's foreign policy is by many of its rivals in the region, but what can we take away in terms of how to understand Qatari foreign policy from an internal perspective, especially in light of all of these different challenges that we've heard, not just in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, but even more broadly, the way that it's formulated its foreign policy in the region, thinking about questions with regards to Iran, for instance, and some of these other matters that Qatar always seems to somehow fall on the other side of what its supposed brethren nations seem to be pushing for.
Well, I'll just follow up on a comment that that Khadija made that I thought was really good, which was this idea of how the economic power is intertwined with the ability to have political power. And there's a great New York Times article from 2005 by a journalist, Romero, who likened the rise of Qatar's liquefied natural gas industry to the rise of Saudi's oil industry in the 1970s. And, you know, that was in 2005, and as we know, it's just increased since then. And that was one of the biggest, riskiest decisions by Amir Hamid to invest in the North Field, and it really paid off. And it gave Qatar just this incredible increased economic power, and with it translates into political power, which they really didn't have the opportunity to engage in as much before. And I'll leave it up to other panelists on their opinions of how Qatar is then engaging in this, but I just think that it's important to keep in mind the economic aspect of this, that they have the ability to do so in ways that they just weren't able to in the past before the LNG really took off.
Dr. Buehler, did you want to respond?
Okay. I guess since this has been a subject that's fascinated me for years, I'll say a couple of things. I'll start out by maybe making the qualifying statement, which is that whatever policy Qatar has pursued abroad has been hampered by human capacity. But it's on the one hand, there's been a very small, coherent policy circle of like-minded people who've been able to make decisions quickly and act on them quickly. But on the other hand, of course, at times working out what the possible consequences might be, who precisely your interlocutors are on the other side, would probably take more time and a lot more people to follow up. And then particular policies once put in place, in principle, usually a policy, once it's designed, hits the ground and hits the battlefield and is in very, very quick need of adjustment. And again, one needs the capacity to adjust that and follow it up consistently. And of course, by definition, it being such a small country with a small group of people who could perform that role, that's often limited. Be part of the explanation for some of the outcomes. However, the underlying strategy, I would say, has been one of utter pragmatism. A very, very pragmatic calculation of how the landscape around it is changing, trying to assess and predict trends, and then rather than sitting back and waiting for things to develop and overwhelm one, and opportunities to escape one, in fact, instead to go in, get in there, and do so as a mediator initially, very often, in some cases successful, in other cases less successful mediator, and thereby build its brand. And in other cases, like I think you were just saying earlier, reacting to a vacuum in a particular situation with the Arab Spring emerging in Tunisia and then Libya, with a vacuum existing around, and there's an opportunity to jump in, take the lead almost, but at least to be seen to be at the front, riding the wave of history rather than being swallowed by it. And there was a judgment made. It was a gamble, but not a crazy gamble. But of course, the precise way in which that then turns out in a chaotic situation like something like the Arab Spring is not always totally predictable. And some of that will explode in one's face. And clearly, there's going to be actors around the region that are not very pleased with this. And Saudi Arabia, or some in Saudi Arabia and some in the UAE, are some of those actors. But ultimately, it's an assessment of what was the direction of politics, political evolution in the Arab world? Well, it was one of some of the old regimes being past their sell-by date. There's no point, I think, the Qatar leadership thought, trying to pretend this was not the case. So what they thought they had to do then, as far as I can see, is try and figure out who were going to be the main players. And one way or another, the Islamist strand of politics was going to be a main factor in this future landscape. So you engage with it, and I think that's what they did. Oh, I should perhaps add to that, a strategy that's typified not just Qatar but other foreign or Gulf states policies for a long time is to do that while always making sure you have a hegemon as a main protector, but then at the same time create complementary channels of succor in diplomatic, economic, and other means. And that's precisely what Qatar has done to very good effect.
Did anyone else want to add anything? Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with the economic aspect to it, but I think it wouldn't be completely fair to narrow down the political path of Qatar to economics in particular. I mean, if you were to assume that the rise of Qatar, by virtue of having increased wealth from the LNG project, that it's very similar to the rise of Saudi to prominence, it would mean that Qatar would follow the same kind of political or social path that Saudi followed. But I think that would take away from kind of the decision-making skills and certain political decisions that Sheikh Hamad himself made during that transition period that makes it differ a bit from Saudi. I mean, Saudi has relatively followed the model of, in particular with its relations to the Arab world, of giving certain amounts of donations and financial packages in order to influence policy in those countries. I mean, granted, Qatar does use some financial aspects in its policy making, but I think they've been really engaged with mediation and effective political decisions at hand.
Professor, if I recall, your question is about Qatari foreign policy and sometimes it being on the wrong side, is what you said.
It's what their opponents say.
It's what the opponents say. I think recently, I mean, Oman just initiated deals with Iran, for example, and I found those very interesting in that it seems to be that the GCC doesn't follow. It seems to be that the GCC doesn't follow a unified position with respect to Iran, and so I don't know, and I don't really know if. I honestly don't quite know how many feathers were ruffled by virtue of I guess, perceived increasing coziness between Qatar and Oman with Iran. I think that's a question I'd like to ask everybody else.
On that one, sorry, people get fed up with my voice. Just start throwing rotten tomatoes. That's a very interesting one, because when people think, without playing down the seriousness of the fact that 3 countries at the same time reduced their diplomatic representation, but nevertheless, when people say Qatar's again on the wrong side also, actually, you're absolutely correct. Oman, in a quieter way, has been pursuing a very similar kind of policy line for a long time. I mean, utterly pragmatic, in other words, locking in a major protector and then having lots of complementary channels. And of course, there are economic and strategic interests at stake too. Oman is sitting right on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz with Iran. At the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war, there was a near clash that nearly turned into a serious military confrontation with Iran, and they quickly decided, let's have a modus vivendi here. And it's been ever thus. And now there are mutual economic interests they can pursue. In the case of Qatar, of course, you have a very small country sitting opposite a giant that's not going to go away, and that giant happens to be sharing the North Dome gas field. But if you look at the spread of Qatar's relations, they've got this absolutely core relationship, security relationship with the United States. In the past, they had an Israeli trade office. They've had relations with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Iran, you name it. Yes, absolutely. So this is not in order. It often comes across with certain groups, certain others, as that Qatar's trying to rile them. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, that has at times been the case. clearly you can see in some periods the reporting of Al Jazeera on Saudi Arabia was, they didn't go out of their way to be kind. But generally speaking, it was not to rile others. It was quite simply saying, making sure that they had as many connections to the outside world as possible. As, again, totally pragmatic.
Dr. Buehler?
Yeah, just to ask another follow-up question on this to any of the panelists. I mean, of course, I think we can think that the manifest tenor of Qatari foreign policy has been about mediation, keeping the channels open with various different players to strike various different deals. But, I mean, what do we think about hard power, especially the recent decision about by the Qatari state to now have mandatory military service for young men? I mean, is this trying to kind of reduce the gap between the economic might or the soft power might and the hard power might, or is this more for domestic political reasons?
Are you sure it's not just a health boot camp?
Well, I mean, that's my question. Is this really just about expanding the opportunities for Qataris to work in the public sector, or is this more really a foreign policy strategy of some kind?
Well, I'll just say that if you want it to be more of a foreign policy and a hard power, you have people sign up for more than 2 to 4 months. So I think it's more of a domestic program that that is for national goals.
I completely agree with that. I mean, health might be one of them, but I think I saw this as part of an economic strategy. Actually, it's about I think inducing commitment to a work ethic, to discipline, etc. And it's of course political. It's part of building the nation. It's part of creating a different component of national cohesion. So it's a symbolic thing. It's about instilling a different kind of ethic as well. That it's not just a rentier state.
I'd like to broaden the discussion a little bit to a big picture question dealing with this notion of the Arab Spring. We are now more than 3 years since that supposed phenomena first took off in early 2011. And of course now there are even doubts of whether there was really something that you could call an Arab Spring, that there was this unified movement that had certain universalistic aspects that spread across the entire Arab world. And so where do we see that 3 years later? And were there these universal goals? Was it the same phenomena that we were witnessing across multiple states, or were there different things going on internally within each one of these cases that became conflated as one movement? I mean, in a recent speech, for instance, Putin said, the Arab Spring has become the Arab Winter. And so, of course, there's also a lot of doubts as far as where those events have led. And so I'd like to see kind of your assessments as far as the Arab Spring 3 years later. And maybe we could begin with one of our student participants, Zach.
I think in the 21st century, we are very fixated on soundbite news. We're very fixated on one-liners. And so obviously when Arab Spring came out and the United States in particular is so prone to promote democracy around the world, it revolutionized more than just the Arab world. It kind of gave hope to the entire world, that area of the world that's been marred with corruption and difficulties, that there could be hope and that it was something obtainable. So when that fails, obviously people are going to start asking questions. Well, why did it fail? Did we see something in the first place? There was a book published recently by a Princeton and NYU professor who said something about the fact that really the Arab Spring will discourage further political movements because it didn't work, so people are no longer willing to go out to the streets and voice their opinions. But I think the time frame is essential here. 3 years is not a lot of time. The United States, it took 200 years. We've had 200 years of democracy, and people forget that democracy is a culture. It's something that you can't just teach to somebody and then instantly expect them to then, perform the requisite tasks, to then peaceful transfer of power, have people come to the polls and vote, get rid of corruption. You have to it takes time, and time is something that we're not very comfortable giving. We want instant results, and so to say the Arab Spring is the Arab Winter, well, maybe, but maybe we'll look back in 20 years and we'll have a different story. So obviously, Arab Winter is another, appealing headline, but I'm not so sure that it's worth even really talking about at this point, given it's only been 36 months.
I mean, I think before I should answer, I should probably say that my answer will be probably influenced by Professor Sumbul, who is sitting here in the audience. So, but I think like a main issue that we have when we critique or analyze the Arab Spring is that we generalize it a lot and we treat it as with such a totality, forgetting that sometimes even when we're talking about economic development or political hopes, that there are socially lived phenomena that depends on who you are, based on gender, based on class, based on political ideologies. It won't unfold, I think, in the same way in any society, even if an effective transition happened. But I think with regards to the issue with like the media or the like policy analysis of the Arab Spring is that mainly we think that hegemony is related to one individual or to one political system, and we forget that it's part of a hegemonic order, meaning that the system has been cemented kind of in the country socially, economically, militarily for a while now, be it in Egypt or in Libya or in Syria or in slightly in Yemen as well. But at the same time, we kind of forget that if we take out one individual, it won't mean that the whole system would change. And I think I agree somewhat with the notion of time and waiting and perhaps that things would unfold, but what I've been recently hearing, especially at Georgetown or maybe in society around us, is that people usually cite the French Revolution model, saying, oh, the French as well took them multiple revolutions to reach where they are. But I think, yes, time is a constraint and time is an issue as well, but the whole notion with time is that if we just wait and analyze from the outside, wouldn't the system cement more and would it become integrated more, making it even harder to accomplish any full transition, even if eventually we might use polls or forms of election in order to transition into a new system? Does it mean that the new leaders that will take on will create any form of total change in society, or will it just be a symbolic one that is based on elections or the change of the head that is sitting?
I think that's a really good point. I think that what goes along with building you think about democracy, you have to build democracy, and how do you build democracy? You have to build institutions that support that democracy. So that means a public servant system where people are willing to just serve the country. You have to have economic stability. You have to have security. And none of those things are present right now across the Middle East as a whole. So if you're lacking all of these key tenets of what the U.S. government would call state building, how can we have an Arab Spring? How can we have democracy? So I think what gets portrayed in the media is these two extremes. We're either going to come into the country and we're going to have change, or we're going to do nothing. I think ultimately it has to be somewhere in the middle, where we have to give ourselves time, give the people of the Middle East time to figure this out and to kind of ingrain this culture into them. But at the same time, there needs to be growth in these institutions that will ultimately make democracy a long-standing system.
Yeah, just to put on a finer point on what Mohammed mentioned a little earlier, is I think we really need to distinguish when we think about the Arab Spring or outcomes related to the Arab Spring between what we might call leadership change and what we might call regime change. And then kind of as a further outcome of that, democratization. So of course, in several Arab countries, we saw various leaders removed from power, like in Yemen, Abd Saleh was removed from power. And of course, he was replaced by his vice president. So for me, it's really hard to say this is an example of a revolution or a regime change of some kind. In Libya, we have a similar type situation. And in Egypt, of course, the military apparatus was never fully removed of any kind. The only real place, I think, where we can see that regime change has taken place is in Tunisia. And what's really interesting, I think, about that case, and really as we think about the way forward, we need to think about Tunisia, is that there was first of all, the military apparatus, the coercive apparatus really decided to withdraw from politics after Ben Ali left Tunisia. It said, we're not going to be involved in the civilian politics, and a new coalition arrived between different opposition groups, Islamists and leftists, who came together and decided to write a constitution. And in doing so, they also didn't marginalize the former members of the old regime. They allowed people like Qaid Ben Sibsi, Kamal Morjan, members of the former regime to participate in politics, criticize the new policies, which really created a type of consensus around the democratic transition. And now what we've seen is that they've been able to establish a new order and really move forward. Of course, this type of consensus has been absent in the other cases.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So when people talk about the Arab winter, first of all, it is far too early, and winter passes generally. Although, look, judging what's been happening in Washington recently, it looks like it never passes. Thank God we're here. But more generally, the case of Tunisia does, to me, show there is indeed hope. Now, this is not to say that everything's sorted out in Tunisia. Not by a long way, but it shows that compromise is possible. And it's interesting, I think, that, I mean, Tunisia, of course, is a fairly small society. It's a relatively highly educated society with a strong middle class. And these are also factors that tend to play, in comparative study of political change. So that's worth keeping in mind. But another interesting thing that's demonstrated in the case of Tunisia is that Islamist strands of politics or of politicians and parties aren't necessarily exclusivist, because Ennahda clearly decided ultimately that it was worth compromising in order to get a constitution that everybody could get around. So it does seem possible. So I think actually what comes out of all of this is that both what Zach was saying about, look, you need a lot more time, and it's not the outside giving the Arab world time. It's more, except in our analysis, it's true that if you look at other kinds of major political instances of change, it's taken not just a long time, but lots of setbacks and back and forth and ups and downs and so on. And institutions don't get built; they tend not to get built smoothly. They tend to emerge after a lot of struggle, But at the same time, as Mohammed was saying, that's no excuse for thinking, oh well, everything should have remained the same. Some people are now nostalgically looking back to the Mubarak era. I mean, to my mind, that's a complete misreading of the situation. And there, I think the leadership of Qatar had it absolutely right. That kind of system was long past its sell-by date and was going to explode at some point. And the longer one waited, the worse the explosion was going to be.
Well, maybe we should shift over to a discussion of from a possible success case with Tunisia to one of the more spectacular failures in Egypt, in terms of the way that the military coup from last July has now solidified into something that is not quite just a return back to the Mubarak regime, but in fact has been described as far worse. If we look at things like the increasingly repressive climate, over 21,000 Egyptians have been arrested. Many of them, of course, there's massive reports of torture. Hundreds have been killed, including over 1,000 on one day in August. Has been one of the most unprecedented shows of violence by the Egyptian military in its modern history. Of course, now we're approaching a situation in which General Sisi, who became Field Marshal Sisi, soon to be President Sisi, is establishing something like a return to authoritarianism. There's clearly no room for democratic politics. I mean, how can we understand the situation as it's developing in Egypt, and where do we see things going? Is this going to stabilize into something like a new authoritarian order, or will it be a return back to the previous regime, or something else entirely? Feel free to step in.
And moderator, as you're the expert on Egypt, we'd like you to step in too.
I don't have a direct answer to this question, but I have a link between the question that you asked previously and this one, in that the easiest way to answer the whole thing about the Arab winter is by saying that it's an incorrect phrase because it's comparing itself to something that is questionable in the first place, i.e. the Arab Spring. And the way that most people justify this line of argument is by pointing to Egypt and saying, well, look at what a beautiful disaster that was. So anyway, that was just my comment on Egypt and this whole, the narrative of the Arab Spring.
Yeah, Dr. Buehler.
I mean, in some ways, I think Abdullah answered his own question the way, but I mean, I tend to agree that I think that the situation is going south very quickly, and that it's going to create a situation that could be much worse than what we saw under Mubarak. I mean, this type of open political violence hasn't been seen in Egypt for decades, really. And it wouldn't surprise me, you know, we saw just recently the release of Ahmed Az, who was one of the biggest benefactors of Mubarak's regime. And I mean, it wouldn't be surprising to me if we saw some kind of NDP equivalent, probably with many of the same characters, with Ahmed Shafiq and others, essentially re-emerge over the next couple years.
Although I think Ahmed Shafiq hasn't he criticized what was going on recently? Anyway, but I'd also, I mean, the question was in part, how did we get here? And clearly, I mean, the security state is being reestablished in all sorts of ways. But the interesting thing is that the reason why those at the top think they can get away with it is because they actually do have genuinely a significant portion of popular support. Whether it's a majority, another question, but certainly there is a significant section of the Egyptian population that says, look, we never want to go back to that terrible period when Morsi was in charge. So in a sense, because the Morsi government, the Morsi regime, was probably the worst thing that could have happened to the Muslim Brotherhood, because they became exclusivist in addition to being incompetent, and so it's not really surprising that in a society as sophisticated and in some ways cosmopolitan and multifarious as Egypt's, with such a long history of being Egyptian as much as anything else, that there was going to be a significant groundswell of opposition to that government. And as so often, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I'm not really surprised it's gone in this direction. It's also because of the things we were talking about before. You know, is there really a deeply rooted institutionalization of consensual or competitive politics where different political strands can be seen as part of a bigger national story? Well, not to any great depth. So it's not very surprising that it was fairly easy for the old institutions to reassert themselves. I don't think this is the end of the story by any means. This is a case where the long term will really have to show, because ultimately, you know, whatever Egyptians feel about the need to avoid Islamist radicalism and Muslim Brotherhood type exclusivism and incompetence, this new regime is going to ultimately, I think, fall by the wayside. Not necessarily Sisi, but a regime of its type is ultimately going to come to an end because the Egyptians will not put up forever with a security state that they overthrew in the first revolution, and B, this will be especially the case because this new regime will also fail economically.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on Egypt? Yeah.
I think with regards to the struggle between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, I mean, it might seem very new on the media now, or maybe because it turned more violent, but I think, and if there's something we also learned at Georgetown here, that it's been going on for quite a while under the Mubarak era as well, but the only issue was that it was not represented in the media. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood did follow their own model under Mubarak of a kind of welfare state that was kind of concentrating in the more impoverished pockets in Egypt, and we're engaged in some form of struggle with the dominant regime back then, but now I think because it became very open to the media that we assume that it's something new. I mean, the whole issue with that goes back to the fact that nothing has really changed in terms of paradigm shifts or in terms of historical events. We're still talking about the same struggle that's been going on in Egypt for maybe around 60 to 70 years, but now because it's more represented in the media, we assume that it's something new. And the whole problem with that is that if the current fervor of supporting the military goes on the notion that the Muslim Brotherhood also underperformed extremely during their government reign, is that the people are kind of lost in the midst in terms of economic development, in terms of actually listening to the demands of the people, because we are so focused on kind of either militant ideologies or more political or Islamist ideologies that we really forget about the initial goals that were echoed in the Arab Spring.
The question of Syria, again, another seemingly intractable conflict. Over 100,000 Syrians have died in the last 3 years, and this is just some of the more conservative estimates. We've seen also a failure of negotiations with the latest round of talks in Geneva. We've also been following as the Syrian military has become increasingly successful at reclaiming parts of the country. And there's been a withdrawal of support from some of the regional allies of the armed Syrian resistance. And so how do we see these events kind of shaping up in the months to come, especially this being kind of a very critical moment in the Syrian conflict, which seems to have reached a sort of impasse, but now perhaps it's being assumed that perhaps some of the regional powers have accepted the fact that the Assad regime will persist in spite of all attempts to try and to bring it down. And so if we can talk maybe about some of the internal dynamics with regard to what's been going on in Syria, as well as the regional and international dimensions, your thoughts? Yeah, Zach?
I think the West has done a disservice, well, maybe not a disservice, but inaction has led to basically no option for the West. So, I mean, that is something that's been in the news for a while, and so I think that should maybe be taken out of the discussion for now, because really it's a lose-lose from Washington's perspective, let's say. Something that I think is really important at this point is the fact that the Syrian conflict is not just Syria anymore. It's spilling over to Lebanon, into Jordan, into Turkey, into Iraq. And that's something that doesn't, at least in the, since I'm studying in the United States, it's nothing that's not in the news at all. So, Lebanon is facing, maybe in a couple of years, a quarter of the population will be registered Syrian refugees. And that's not even talking about the violence that has been plaguing the country because of Hezbollah's participation in alliance with al-Assad. Let alone Jordan, a country that has always had a refugee problem, is getting more refugees. Services won't be able to sustain that. The civil war is sparking up again in Iraq, and Turkey is facing potential problems with the PYD and its own PKK issue. So that isn't even talking about how donor states have been supporting the rebels or al-Assad or even Hezbollah. I mean, there's so many dynamics here, but it goes beyond just the internal functions. And it's very callous to say maybe let Syria stand alone for a second, but I think at this point, intervention must be thought of broader, that we need to maybe start thinking about how we can support these weaker countries on the periphery that could really enlarge the conflict into something that really nobody could stop.
Mohammed?
I would agree with Zach, especially with regards to the regional development of the whole Syrian conflict. I mean, granted, there is a good amount of refugee aid that is going into the camps in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, but I think the three countries are following kind of a different model that doesn't really lead to any solution. In Jordan, they're more centralized within the Zaatari camp in particular, but in Lebanon, for example, some of them are in UN camps, but others are accorded some form of social movement, and that while that might seem beneficial in terms of the increasing kind of the socioeconomic level of the refugees there, I would say it actually adds to more internal struggles in a sense that kind of the usual paradigm of a developing sense of racism against kind of refugees taking more lower income positions that would have potentially not even went to anyone in society, but just by virtue of being taken by a foreigner, get turned into a whole other political issue. So apart from the whole issue in Syria really being a mess, the regional countries surrounding it, I mean, apart from Turkey, I don't think Lebanon and Jordan are very capable of kind of dealing with the whole spillover of it.
Sure. I mean, you asked about the dynamics in Syria. So I'd say two things. First, about the origins of it all. I'm assuming people here now are familiar with that, but it's still worth lancing this, obscuring this myth that somehow the Syrian case is another example of the Arab Spring being fermented by outsiders, and particularly the Qataris and the Saudis. This was, to my mind, absolutely a domestic conflict in the first instance. which was really about rebelling for different reasons than in Egypt and Tunisia and so on, but significant parts of the population rebelling against a regime that's in many ways beyond the pale. And then, of course, once you have that and it goes on for long enough, then there's the opportunities for outsiders to start taking sides and intervening and so on. So, of course, that's gradually grown. I think we are where we are partly, I think you, Zach, you referred, I think that's what you were hinting at, partly because of the nature of what outsiders did not do. And I think that my position has long been, although it's now water under the bridge, that there was a chance to avoid this outcome at some cost, but at less cost than we're now faced with, by having a more forceful intervention, by both giving greater support to the moderate coalition when it still existed, or was still meant something, and putting up some safe corridors and a no-fly zone over a corner of Syria and on the Turkish border. And now, as far as the, say, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are concerned, they also made very serious mistakes, both. So I'm not taking sides here. By channeling some of their funding to groups and individuals who clearly, who were not the most consensual types of politicians, let's put it very mildly, but also by not getting together. I mean, effectively, both sides said, we want to support some of these groups of an Islamist nature, but we won't support the kinds of groups that are supporting by the other side. So the division on the part of the outsiders was as bad as the fact that they chose, as the aid or the intervention that they did bring. So we're now left with as you said, a lose-lose situation. It's very hard to see a desirable outcome, but you do see, as Abdullah suggested, you do see, as always, a pragmatic reassessment by outside players of what is and isn't possible. And this is not just true in the West, it's also true in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar. There is not a complete dropping of principles, but there is certainly a reassessment and an adjustment to what is seen as, having realized that the original aims are unachievable. Dr. Buehler?
Yeah, I just want to agree with the other panelists that the West in some capacity should have become involved sooner and with more force potentially. But I think now we have to think about, given Syria's incredibly complicated sectarian nature, the sectarian nature of the regime, of the various coalitions behind the regime, I mean, is the only way forward really some kind of partition, where we're seeing Alawi communities protected that might give Bashar al-Assad some kind of sense where he can at least begin to come to the negotiation table in a real meaningful way? I mean, I think at the core that the sectarian coalition that backs Bashar al-Assad needs to have some kind of credible commitment that their groups will be not subject to reprisal in the aftermath of this conflict. And of course, giving those kind of credible commitments is very difficult.
True, but even that, it's worth noting that it's not just the Alawis who support, A, it's not just the Alawis who should support Bashar al-Assad, and B, not all the Alawis support Bashar al-Assad, so it's even more complicated. Yes, and it's a very depressing situation, so I'm afraid I can't prescribe solutions on that one.
It's been really interesting listening to everyone's perspective, but I think it's important not to say the West dropped the ball, we should have, with more force, and especially, of course, we're talking about the US and Britain here, both of whom had heads of state who wanted to go in with force after the chemical weapons attacks, and then were not able to. And I think it's important to remember that this is, of course, an extremely frustrating situation between professed ideals and professed rhetoric of the heads of state and what ends up happening or not happening in these countries. But we have checks and balances in the US. I discussed this in my intro American politics class. We actually have so many checks and balances in our system that in many ways the president has no real power. And It's really up to Congress to pass a lot of bills and to okay a lot of actions. There's a reason why not a single other democracy in the world models itself exactly after the American system. We have so many checks and balances that sometimes nothing works anymore. I would recommend looking at Robert Dahl has this great book, short, beautiful, called How Democratic is the American Constitution. Kind of gives a nice comparative perspective on that. But I think we have to be careful about saying the West should have done this and then everything would have been fine. The West couldn't do this, and this is where we are today.
Certainly, a formal declaration of war has to come through Congress, but for example, the president acted unilaterally in terms of getting involved in Libya. There could have been lots of things that we could have done. And the fact that the West has done basically nothing, to me, is morally unacceptable.
Dr. Buehler, I wanted to ask you specifically about, given your expertise in Morocco, it's a country that, of course, is left out of the discussions of the Arab Spring, although we have seen some attempts at some kind of liberalization of the political process. We've seen the election of a minority, or rather the opposition being the Islamist party there. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how it fits into this broader narrative of change in the Arab Spring?
Sure. So Morocco is my country of specialty. And Morocco has a very interesting history where various opposition groups over time have been brought into governance. There, of course, the king is always in the background controlling most of the major political decisions, but at various times, different political parties have been brought into the coalition and given opportunities to run limited governance. So recently, the Morocco's Muslim Brotherhood, the Justice and Development Party, was brought into governance responsibilities in November 2011, and almost immediately it was shown that the party was weakened by the regime. It was forced into a variety of different alliances with various pro-regime parties, pro-regime actors, which really inhibited its ability to implement the reforms that it had hoped to implement, or it had pledged to implement during the campaign. So that, in addition to various kind of unfortunate incidents of political mismanagement, kind of similar to what we saw in Egypt, has really handicapped what the party has been able to accomplish, though they seem still intent on trying to implement as many reforms as they can before the next elections. I think a big turning point we'll have to see is in 2 years they should have the local elections. And exceptionally in Morocco, in terms from a regional perspective, these local elections are very important for this country in that they usually give an opportunity for tribal actors that are associated with the regime, with the monarchy, to reassert their power. So it'll be interesting to see whether in a year or two, if the various pro-regime parties like the Party of Authenticity and Modernity or the National Rally of Independence essentially use these communal elections to reassert their power and further constrain the power of the Islamists.
I wanted to turn our attention to Iraq, a country that we don't really see as much about in the news these days, but today is we are commemorating the 11th anniversary of the US-led invasion of Iraq that happened in 2003. That, of course, over the course of the next decade led to the deaths of over 1 million Iraqis, the fracturing of the country, the divisions, that was supposed to produce something like an effective democratic model for the rest of the region. And so I wanted to ask our panelists about their thoughts 11 years later since the invasion of Iraq, where things stand in Iraq now. Was this, in hindsight at least, and I know this was obviously an unpopular war even from the very start, but was it clearly a strategic error on the part of the Bush administration in 2003?
I think the current situation in Iraq, I don't think is very pleasant or positive in terms of how it's represented. I mean, I recently saw on the media that Baghdad alone had, I think, around 234 bombs in 1 month, and which is obviously a ridiculous number for any state. But I think the problem in Iraq is that the political system is still not inclusive, even under the Maliki government, so there still has been any actual transition. It's just a transition to a different side. And I mean, I would say the whole notion of kind of a, maybe not necessarily a federation, but more kind of segments of Iraq gaining independence is more strong than it is with Syria. I mean, Kurdistan, even though they still say it's part of Iraq and has some form of internal autonomy, it's technically functioning as if its own country with its own economy, own visa policies. I mean, it's just so separate from Iraq. Even they're not encouraging Arabic, they're completely different language. I mean, and the Shia-Sunni kind of split in Iraq, I think, has reached kind of extreme levels, I would say. Apart from talking about the political system, I'm not sure if any norm of social life can still hold in Baghdad in particular with such threats of violence and bombs at this point.
Yeah, Zach.
I think, on your point about kind of these sectarian splits, I think, and we posed a question about strategic error. I think something that, obviously, I certainly was not in any of the strategic rooms before going into the war, but I think something that at least doesn't get talked about very much is what the war did for the region as a whole. And obviously, I'm not saying that Saddam Hussein was a good person, not that he should be in power, but removing him has created a power vacuum in the Middle East that has, traditionally been balanced on one side by Iraq and Saudi Arabia, on the other side Iran. And I think it's interesting to look at how these two, basically Iran and Saudi Arabia, have kind of, coming to the fore now. And is that because Saddam Hussein's not there anymore? Is there no longer a check? Is that why we're seeing such aggressive policy in the Middle East? I think it's also interesting to think about the Kurdish question. Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, is providing a very appealing model to other Kurdish groups around the Middle East. It's the largest ethnic group without a state. It's something that Turkey has dealt with for, decades. Certainly it's an issue in Syria. Even Iran has its own, issues, though that doesn't get talked about very much. So in addition to the strife, the struggle that we see as a democratic model and the security issue within the borders of Iraq, I think there's much to be talked about in terms of what's happening around the region, and something that really should, I think, be highlighted more.
I think it's safe to say that the war was expensive and unnecessary, and I think most people are in agreement with that. Iraq is remembered, fortunately enough, given the American public's short memory with respect to remembering things that are important. Iraq was remembered when the whole question of putting boots on the ground in Syria came up. So that's an interesting link between the two countries. But ironically so, Iraq is forgotten by and large, and I think what needs to be talked about perhaps is the role of the media in elevating certain things to be vogue topics, for example, Syria these days, and in helping to forget others.
At the risk of being controversial, I think counterfactuals are always tricky, but I think there is a case to be made that some invasion or some form of the operation in Iraq 11 years ago now might have been less disastrous than things actually turned out. Because I remember I was following this very closely at the time, and I was discussing things and various people and coming up with a list of things that absolutely had to be done if this very, very dangerous operation was going to have any chance of being other than a disaster, and a list of things that absolutely must not be done. And I, being my naive, optimistic self, thought surely these decision makers are going to get most of these things right. Well, in fact, 99% of them were gotten exactly the other way around. So it is, I think, conceivable that a different outcome might have been reached. Not everything rosy, still very problematic, but clearly not the sort of utter murderous disaster that it's turned out to be. And it was really the first few months that locked this outcome in, and it needn't, that particular outcome needn't quite have been this way. But so I've always thought about it as a case of criminal negligence more than anything else. But the other side of it is, I think, that that kind of misconduct, which was, of course, ideologically driven, or the blindness was ideologically driven in the States. The kinds of people who were brought in because they were from a particular political strand, and in fact, some of those few that actually did know something about the country were purposely evicted from some parts of the policy process. I remember. But anyway, the thing that's also worth keeping in mind is Iraq is a very peculiar country. And and of course I lived there for some time, and is a fabulous country in many ways, huge depths of culture, wonderful middle class, and educated population and so on. But as a polity has been hugely problematic right from the start, from when it was established in the aftermath of the First World War. And really from the 1930s onwards, the way in which it was run was largely through violence as a means of political organization and as a means of enforcing one's particular view of how the country should evolve. It's true that there was a liberal politics period, a parliamentary politics period in Iraq. In the 50s in particular, actually, there was a moment when everything looked as if it might go in the right direction. But ultimately, I think this has been, the country has been, because of the divisions that Matt's talked about already, but particularly because it was set up by the outside world. It was set up in an area where there were all these sectarian and ethnic divisions, but that might have been managed differently. But it was set up on the basis of running of an ultimately autocratic system dominated by the minority, which is the Sunni Arabs. And really that was simply grafting a new state onto what had already been the custom under the Ottomans, which is, they used to run that area, that region, through the local Sunni bourgeoisie. And then from the 1930s, you get, of course, nationalism became very powerful throughout the region, and you got some military officers deciding that it was time they took over because the government of the time wasn't sufficiently looking after the interests of the Iraqi nation as opposed to the Kurds, for instance. And from then on, it's been this refrain. So the problem with Iraq, I think, is that you end up with a polity which almost isn't a polity, and where violence has become endemic. So in a way, that's not to say that it is condemned forever to be like that, but I think it's worth keeping in mind this historical background, where violence has been part and parcel of Iraqi political history. And the case of Saddam Hussein, which is about the most egregious example of autocratic brutalism that I've ever encountered, is simply one more illustration, one more instance of that Iraqi political history.
I do want to open it up to questions from the audience in just a couple of moments, if we can get those microphones ready. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention Palestine. It's interesting how in just a few short years, it's gone from being at the top of the list of things to talk about with regard to the Middle East to somewhere near the bottom of the list. And I think that's not only a consequence of the fact that there are obviously some very pressing crises that have erupted all over the region during this time, but also due to the fact that there hasn't been the kind of progress. We continue to have the same kinds of conversations now for 20 years since the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords in 1993. We've seen that there's this ongoing so-called peace process that has yet to yield a Palestinian state. And I think the question is, how can we understand this process in light of the challenges that are emerging over the course of these 20 years with regard to settlement expansion, especially in the West Bank, that have made the possibility of a Palestinian state increasingly non-viable. And of course the continued siege on Gaza, which has only intensified, especially over the past year since the coup in Egypt, which of course has intensified pressure on the civilian population therein. And so maybe the panelists can kind of give their reflections on the state of the possibilities, at least, of what kinds of outcomes we might see with regard to the question of Palestine.
just say something on, I mean, I don't think it's new, but I feel that the peace talks in particular between the PLO and Israel have become increasingly symbolic, per se. Maybe you need to have them in every form of American presidency every now and then, but I don't think they will, at least if they still remain the way they are, I don't think they're ever going to lead to any actual viable political outcome or state outcome for Palestine in particular. And I think the issue with I mean, I would say there has been increasing, not to be a complete pessimist, there has been increasing international support for the Palestinian cause in particular in the West, while like in media we see in the Arab world is most focused on the Arab Spring because it's the hot topic now. But what's interesting is that the Palestinians are, I think in particular the ones who are being displaced as refugees are going through the same problems that a lot of the Arab refugees are going through from Syria in particular, but by virtue of being branded as stateless, they're not being able to be absorbed as, or to get the official status of a refugee, be it in camps in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Turkey in particular. So the dynamics of being Palestinian and being an Arab refugee and fleeing into an Arab country are really interesting, seeing that the two seem to exist in such a binary, even though technically the Palestinians are Arab refugees who were refugees in one country and then had to be displaced again into another country.
Khadija?
On the, Harb brought up international support. I think I don't have the solution to the problem, obviously, but I think that the solution is going to require Israel to be on board, as much as that might not sit well with people. And then in that context, I think it's interesting how it's reacting to current negotiations between America and Iran. And I think that's an interesting aspect to look at just in terms of current affairs and how much that coziness, how cozy it is really, and how much that coziness truly angers Israel. And then of course, you could disagree with me and say, well, Israel doesn't really need to be part of the solution, but I think it does. And insofar as it does, how does international acceptance of Iran factor in to resolving the conflict? I think that's more of a question than an answer.
Yeah, Zach?
I totally agree. I mean, I don't have an answer either. I think, at least from an American perspective, that's a very active and persuasive and strong Israel lobby. And so from our perspective, we really don't hear the side of the Palestinians very often. And I think there's a lot that could be gained by a conversation with hardline conservative Israelis in the process who choose to live in settlements, choose to push the boundaries of the Israeli state, and basically are co-opting land in the process. I think, I'm no expert, but I imagine this has been a process that has been going on for a while, and prime ministers in Israel have been supportive or not supportive of that process. So I think ultimately you're right. Israel needs to be, I think, more on board with this process than they might be perceived to be. I mean, these peace talks are great and all, but nothing's happening, as we've said. So I think there needs to be some more action. I also think, as Khadija said, Iran is an important player. I think it's possible that they can be involved. I mean, Trita Parsi wrote Treacherous Alliance, and he outlined very clearly this kind of triangular relationship. And it's a frustrating book to read because there seems so many instances where trouble could have been avoided, like so many instances in hindsight. So ultimately, I think it just is going to take more collaboration across potential, perceived enemies than what we've really seen so far. I mean, there's no easy fix, there's no quick fix. I mean, those are obvious statements. I think one other kind of obvious point I'd like to bring up is the fact that, Palestine, as we see it on the map today, is two separate entities. In Israel, from a logistical standpoint, how is that going to work? I don't know. Pakistan, dealt with that issue, and Bangladesh separated in a very bloody civil war. There are a lot of dynamics that are not the same. Maybe that kind of state solution, there are similarities, but I think it's something to be cognizant of, that we can't just expect, Palestine to sit there separated and then have it work.
I would just like to say that I actually view it as a very positive thing that John Kerry has been putting so much time into lately, shuttling back and forth, talking to both sides, putting the pressure on. I think in some ways Barack Obama sees this in the same way that Bill Clinton probably saw it in the late 1990s. He's in his second term. This could be a legacy. This could be a legacy of foreign policy success if we can somehow get a two-state solution. And I think we're in a better position than the Bill Clinton, Dennis Ross, etc. era of the late 1990s, because I think that U.S. foreign policy as it stands now does have a better understanding of what's going on with the Palestinians and the problems with continued occupation for American interests in the region besides Israeli interests and Arab interests. So there's a lot at stake here, and I have a feeling that we will continue to see hard pressure. Obama and Netanyahu are not friends, and they don't pretend to be, and Netanyahu knows that. And I think that they're kind of playing a good cop, bad cop thing right now between Obama as the bad cop and Kerry as the good cop. But I like seeing the pressure, and I like seeing the world, the focus on this issue. And I hope that in the next couple of years we will see significant progress or possibly even a solution, simply because this foreign policy team has a limited lifespan and it doesn't have anything to lose by trying all out.
Yes, I think I'll put my optimistic hat on just for a few seconds, because I think that's the one ray of hope that we might have. The fact that there is really significant understanding and knowledge about the Middle East, about the Palestinian question in the administration now, and the fact that they haven't got anything to lose. At least there's always the question about what other policy priorities do they have, particularly domestically. Might they want to, might those become more important when they balance them? Because ultimately, yes, it does require pressure. And it's true, of course, Israel, as much as the Palestinians have to be on board, but on occasion, pressure can help make people change their calculations as to whether it's worth coming on board. It was actually it was very close the last time round when in the Camp David negotiation when Clinton was still involved, particularly then actually a few months later, when the Clinton parameters were put out there, and there was things had gone pretty far, but it wasn't just Arafat who was a useless negotiator, understandable because in a position of weakness, but it was also Barak who was unwilling to risk his political position in Israel, and of course in the end it just ran up against the deadline of the Israeli election. So it's not as if it's not clear what the outline solution should look like. The question is whether the Israeli, well, particularly not Netanyahu, is how he calculates his political future ultimately. And I think one of the first things that ought to be dropped really is this insistence, which is quite new, that before any agreement can be reached, the Palestinians have to accept the formulation that Israel is recognized as a Jewish state. That's newly introduced. That's making things worse rather than better. But I'll now take my optimistic hat off.
Sorry, just to follow. Oh, sorry.
So, do you all think that Obama deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for as much as he's done thus far?
I love your questions.
Because this seems to me like another example of inaction, just like Syria.
I'll mention that if Saudi Arabia would like to regain its amazing diplomatic prowess pre-Qatar, then it can continue, as it has done, to propagate its 2002 peace plan, which was a very, very good deal for Israel, which was that if Israel, accepts this two-state solution, then every Arab country has peace with Israel. And this has been continually there and at the negotiation table. And I think that this is a time when Saudi Arabia can really jump in and show some diplomatic leadership again. And that could also continue to put the pressure on Israel by giving them no real good reasons to say no to a two-state solution.
Let's open it to some questions from the audience. Yeah.
Or objections.
Or objections. Yeah. Right here in the front, Tal.
Hi, thank you all for your great comments. I just have a couple comments. Just to go back on the topic of the Arab Spring, democracy, and the West, namely the US, I think it's, at this point, I do agree with what Zachary said in terms of it is too early. I think it's a bit naive to assume that you can uproot decades and decades of oppressive and extractive institutions overnight or even in a decade or whatever. It has to come through a process of trial and error. It has to come gradually, and it has to come through dialogue. But I think at the same time, when we approach the concept of democracy, that we have to approach it cautiously, or at least critically, and that we can't assume that a democratic institution is always necessarily inspired by basic human rights. If we think of the example of Egypt, if there isn't a culture of adhering to such principles, maybe the majority of Muslims would, under the veil of democracy, be able to oppress the Coptic minority. Now, I think most states at this point are democratic, actually, but at the same time, most of them are flawed democracies. And I think that's, we have to draw the line and we have to really distinguish. In terms of the American democratic model, I think we should also approach that critically and just think of America's role in maintaining a lot of the regimes that were in place to begin with, namely especially the Hosni Mubarak regime. And in terms of its relations with Israel, with its foreign aid, it's simply facilitating the expansion of illegal settlements as we speak. It's vetoed countless resolutions in the UN that could have, helped perhaps reach a resolution or a solution. Just if anything, I feel, from my opinion, that if anything came out as a conclusion from the Arab Spring, it's that each country needs to go through its own process and create its own model that kind of applies to its own specific cultural, political, social, and economic context, and that we should stop trying to, why is the West not doing anything about it? Because whenever we want to, we say, why is the West not coming in? And whenever we want to, we're like, why is the West coming in? I think we should stop approaching the West as if it's, or the US at least, as if, it's the moral compass of the world, because first of all, morality isn't absolute, and secondly, the West or the US is coming to terms with that and realizing that the US can't really get involved in every single juncture. So that was just my comment, and just to wrap it up, I personally don't see a two-state solution ever happening. Just to touch on what Zachary also said, it's actually not two entities. It's literally if you really look at the map and how it's penetrated by numerous checkpoints and settlements, it's, the Palestinian territories are, it's like Bantustans. It's not really, I don't see it being feasible ever. Thanks.
Any thoughts or reactions from the panel? Other questions?
Considering what happened in Bahrain during the Arab Spring in terms of the populist uprising, the protests, and the ensuing intervention by the GCC, do you think that in the coming years the current monarchical system as is a sustainable one, or do you envision another kind of mass protest in the coming future? How do you think that will play out?
Okay, I'll give that a go. Are we talking about the system in Bahrain or the monarchical system in the region? If we're talking about the case of Bahrain, I think the Bahraini, a section of the Bahraini royal family played its politics particularly badly, I think. Of course, they're still there, still ruling the roost, because they've been willing to use significant amounts of violence, and with some help from Saudi Arabia, but that's been more economic and diplomatic help. And it's not the military intervention was actually rather limited. But what they've managed to do is to create a sectarian, radicalized opposition that wasn't there before. So that's very sad for Bahrain, and indeed for, you might say, for the Al Khalifa, which is why there are significant portions of the Al Khalifa who think differently, including the Crown Prince, by all accounts. So, but I think what you do see in a lot of the monarchies in this region is that there is ultimately a will to adjust when necessary. It's just that the Bahraini monarchy has been particularly bad in the last few years at doing that. I expect that they will adjust. They will not turn into a democracy, but it will adjust and survive. So that's, if I had to bet, that's what I'd bet. So as to the wider implications for the monarchical system or model in the Gulf states, I do not side with Christopher Davidson, whom some of you might have read, when he has this cover on his book, he said, when the monarchs will fall. In fact, if you actually read the content of his book, of course, yes, sure, there are tensions and problems. We all agree with those, but his material doesn't support his conclusion. Let's put it that way. And I would also similarly say, sure, these systems will come to a different extent under pressure, economically, socially, ideologically, and so on. But as long as they keep adjusting as they have been in the past, I don't see any major regime transformation happening. Certainly not in the foreseeable future.
Professor Mitchell.
I like the analysis. I also think that Davidson could have elaborated more on how he tied his X to his Y. But I do think that the question of the energy subsidies in particular here in the Gulf are a particular point of tension for the future. Because basically for every country, with the exception of Qatar, the governments are soon going to be faced with the decision between maintaining their current levels of energy subsidies to their citizens and maintaining their current levels of exports. So it's really a choice between short-term political stability or longer-term economic sustainability. A guy named Jim Crane, who used to work at the University of Cambridge, and now he's at Rice University, he does energy policy studies that are excellent on this topic. But I think that, when we're talking about the Gulf, the bigger question really is this idea of what happens if economic sustainability is chosen as a policy. Are citizens going to be okay with energy subsidies being taken away from them? The historical record has no precedent for this. Even in the 1980s with the oil bust, subsidies kept right on rolling, and the governments just basically hoped that things would turn back around before they went bankrupt, which luckily for them, they did. But so in the citizen's mind, these subsidies become a right of citizenship, not as a generous gift given in times of economic, largesse. So what we see here is a problem where the Gulf governments may actually turn to importing more and more of their energy needs, such as using natural gas, turning to nuclear power, making the political decision to focus more on those subsidies for their citizens than prioritizing economic sustainability, which could have some long-term consequences in the future.
Yeah. Dr. Buehler.
Just to put some historical background on the specific case of Bahrain, few people know this, but actually Bahrain has a very contentious history. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were pan-Arab nationalist movements, and people say that, various sectarian communities used those to mobilize in the 70s and 80s as well. And really, these protests seem to come in cycles within the kingdom. But one constant that we see is the continuing presence of either British or American naval facilities on the island, which helps to create a situation of stability and certainly American interest in stabilizing the regime there. You would see that there's although the U.S. hasn't played a very active role in resolving the Syria dispute or in terms of pushing forward negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, the administration has been very active in terms of promoting the reconciliation process, which most of the Shia pretty much just dismiss as being not very serious on the part of the Khalifa dynasty. So I think that we need to think about the American influence on these islands and whether it's, trying to promote democratization or trying to inhibit it.
Okay, we have one question there, and then we have to wrap up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the discussion on foreign policy, Qatar's foreign policy. So recently it sort of suffered a number of setbacks, you could say. The Muslim Brotherhood backed in Egypt and to some extent Tunisia are no longer in power. They haven't been able to remove Bashar al-Assad from power despite sort of copious amounts of funding to various rebel groups. And perhaps you could even see that 3 Gulf countries withdrawing their ambassadors as another setback. So I was wondering, has the little brother overplayed his hand? Has it stretched too far? Will it have to scale back? And if so, where and how?
Well, like when Zach said that he wasn't asked before the 2003 Iraq invasion, well, nobody has invited me into the inner foreign policy circle of Qatar. But I would say that a lot of people who do study Qatari foreign policy, whom I've spoken with, would say that the change of power to the new emir over the summer was precisely this reset in Qatari foreign policy. So we're already seeing this change. And I know 2 academics who had books coming out on Qatari foreign policy, and they were supposed to come out in January. And when this happened in the summer, they both delayed them until the summer because they had to kind of put in some extra material into their books. So I'm really looking forward to reading those 2 books, one by Dave Roberts and one by Christian Ulrichsen. But I think what their analyses are is that there was a bit of maybe a sense of overplaying, and that they wanted to be able to change some of their emphases. I'm not sure if we've seen a 180-degree change, but maybe at least to reset and give an appearance that there will be some different tacks taken and some different voices heard. That might have been what we saw this summer.
Could I'd go along with that, but I would probably put a slightly different slant on, in the sense that, yes, there was a reassessment. As I was saying earlier, I think pragmatism is the hallmark of Qatari foreign policy, of what drives Qatari foreign policy. It may not always get all gambles right, but ultimately it's pragmatic adjustment that counts. And so this pragmatic reassessment was underway well before the handover of power to Sheikh Tamim. In fact, Sheikh Tamim was associated with a lot of the earlier policies anyway. But there was a gradual shift, and it certainly didn't cause the handover, because that had been planned quite some time before. So, but it's just another example of where Qatar, yes, occasionally oversteps, makes the wrong connections to the wrong kinds of people, because they weren't, let's say, maybe no due diligence had been done on some of those people. And because you cannot predict all the fallout of complex situations like these situations that they got involved in Syria and Libya and Egypt. But a reassessment was underway already, and the handover just coincided with it, I would suggest. And the reassessment was also linked to domestic questions of economic management. So Qatar was at a point where it had become very, very ambitious in all sorts of areas. This was very expensive, and it was also beginning to get a little bit diplomatically expensive. But in terms of economic management, I think the watchword became more careful husbandry of resources. And that's become sort of the theme of what Sheikh Tamim has been saying. But I don't think it's caused by the change. It was the two things have kind of evolved in tandem, I'd say. And certainly there is no 180-degree turnaround, nor will there be a 180-degree, not even 90-degree turnaround. It's an adjustment of tone. You saw that this, and again, this was underway before the handover. The attempt to mollify the Saudis as soon as, was declared the Amir. The fact that 2 shiploads of LNG free of charge that had been planned before the changeover in Egypt was still allowed to sail without payment, and so on. There's a number of things that Qatar was indicating, look, we don't necessarily want to seek conflict in all of this, but they weren't really given much of an option, I think, by the Egyptian government's, the new Egyptian government's policies. So did they overreach in some respects? Yes. But that was part of a conscious, pragmatic gamble. And in some respects they succeeded, in some respects they didn't. That comes with this kind of gamble.
Any other responses? Zach?
I'll just say really quickly that while I think it's worth thinking about it in this way, the fact that Qatar has been willing to step forward and start, engaging a little more actively diplomatically, it seems, at least, from the outside, especially my perspective, is very on the outside. But I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, even if they get some things wrong. Showing commitment to initiatives outside of their borders just gives people something to think about moving forward. And especially trying to assert their influence, I think that might actually be beneficial for them in the long run.
Perhaps it's quite fitting that we begin and end with Qatar. Please join me in thanking our panelists.